A cold wind whispered through the quiet village as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the cobbled streets. In the heart of this village lived an old man named Elias, known to all as the wise storyteller. He had seen the rise and fall of generations, and his words carried the weight of experience, shaping the hearts and minds of those who listened. People sought him out not for riches or power, but for something far more valuable: wisdom. One evening, as the townsfolk gathered in the village square, Elias took his usual seat beneath the great oak tree. The air was thick with anticipation, for whenever he spoke, the world around them seemed to pause, hanging on to every syllable. That night, however, his story would be different. It would not be about kings or warriors, nor about magic or lost treasures. Instead, it would be about something far more powerful: words. As the murmurs of the crowd settled into silence, Elias cleared his throat. "Many believe that swords and wealth shape the world," he began, his voice steady yet full of mystery. "But I tell you, the most powerful force in existence is the words we speak." The villagers leaned in closer, their curiosity piqued. Among them sat a young man named Daniel, who had always been skeptical of such ideas. To him, words were just sounds, nothing more. How could mere words hold power over fate? Sensing Daniel's doubt, Elias smiled knowingly. "Let me tell you a story," he continued. "A tale of a boy who learned the true weight of his words, and how they changed not only his life but the lives of those around him." The village square seemed to shrink as everyone focused on the old man's voice. Even the wind seemed to hush, eager to listen. "This boy," Elias went on, "was not unlike many of you. He was quick to speak but slow to understand. He thought words were merely fleeting things, thrown into the air and forgotten. But he was wrong." Daniel crossed his arms, still unconvinced, but he found himself unable to look away. There was something about Elias's tone, something that made him feel as though this story was meant for him. "The boy," Elias continued, "had a habit of speaking without thinking. He would tease his friends, mock the weak, and throw careless words like stones in a river, not realizing the ripples they created. He believed that once spoken, words disappeared. But words do not vanish, my friends. They take root." The villagers exchanged glances, each recalling moments in their own lives when words had shaped their choices, their happiness, or their sorrow. "Then one day," Elias said, lowering his voice, "the boy spoke a single sentence, just a few careless words. And those words, they changed everything." A hush fell over the crowd. Even Daniel felt his heart quicken. He wanted to know, what had the boy said? And what had it cost him? Elias let the silence linger before he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You see, words are like seeds. Once planted, they grow. And this boy, he was about to learn that some words, once spoken, can never be taken back." The night deepened, the air thick with suspense. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, as if urging Elias to continue. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned back, his eyes glinting with wisdom. "That," he said, "is a tale for another moment." A groan of protest rose from the crowd, but Elias merely chuckled. "Patience," he said. "For the lesson in this story is not just in its telling, but in how you choose to listen." Daniel, for the first time in his life, felt a strange unease, a realization stirring deep within him. Words, he thought. Could they truly hold such power? And if they did, what did that mean for the words he had spoken? The answer he would soon find out. 2 of 2. The night air felt heavier now, as if Elias's words had stirred something unseen. The villagers, though eager for the story to continue, knew better than to rush him. Elias had a way of letting silence speak just as loudly as his voice. Daniel sat back, his arms still crossed, but something gnawed at him. He had never thought much about the power of words before. Sure, he had said things in the past, some kind, some harsh, but they had always felt like nothing more than sounds carried away by the wind. What could one sentence possibly do to change everything? As if sensing his thoughts, Elias leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp but kind. "This boy, the one who spoke without thinking," he said, his voice softer now. He learned a lesson in a way he never expected. And that lesson did not come swiftly, it came slowly, like a shadow creeping up behind him. The fire in the center of the square crackled, sending up sparks that danced in the dark. The villagers listened, hanging on to every word. "This boy," Elias continued, "was named Samuel. He was like many young men, restless, full of pride, and always quick to laugh. But his laughter often came at the expense of others. He never meant harm, at least, that's what he told himself. A joke here, a teasing word there. Just harmless fun, he thought." Daniel shifted in his seat. He had always believed that words didn't carry weight unless someone chose to let them. If a person was too weak to brush off an insult, wasn't that their problem? He glanced around and noticed that others were listening just as intently, their faces thoughtful. One evening, Elias went on. Samuel was with his friends near the riverbank. The air was warm, and the stars reflected on the water's surface. It was the kind of night that made everything feel lighter, as if no trouble could ever reach them. That's when they saw him, Lucas. At the mention of the name, some villagers murmured. It was a common enough name, but something about the way Elias said it made it feel important. Lucas was different, Elias said. Not weak, not foolish, just different. He was quiet where others were loud, thoughtful where others were quick to speak. Some admired him, but many did not understand him. And Samuel? Well, he saw Lucas as an easy target. A strange tension settled over the square. The story was beginning to feel too real, too familiar. Everyone had seen a Samuel before, and everyone had known a Lucas. Samuel, Elias continued, was in a playful mood that night. He called out to Lucas, teasing him for the way he walked, the way he spoke, the way he always seemed lost in his own thoughts. His friends laughed, and emboldened by their amusement, Samuel pushed further. He didn't mean for his words to cut deep. He was only playing, only making the others laugh. But Lucas didn't laugh. He only stood there, his face unreadable. Daniel felt a strange discomfort in his chest. He had seen moments like this before, had even been part of them. A harmless joke, a little push to make others laugh. It was never meant to be serious. Then, Elias said, his voice quieter now, Samuel spoke the words that would change everything. Just a few careless words. They left his lips easily, without thought, without restraint. And when they landed, they struck harder than any blow could have. Silence stretched over the square. Even the wind had died down. "What did he say?" a young girl whispered, barely loud enough to be heard. Elias looked at her, his expression unreadable. "That is not the important part," he said, because the words themselves, though cruel, were not the only thing that mattered. What mattered was what they did. The villagers sat in the stillness, waiting. "Lucas left that night without a word," Elias continued. And at first, Samuel and his friends thought nothing of it. But the next day, Lucas did not come to the river. Nor the next. Days turned into weeks, and still, he was nowhere to be found. Some said he had left the village, others whispered that he had simply faded into the background, retreating from the world. But one thing was certain, he was not the same. Something inside him had shifted, as if Samuel's words had stolen a part of him that could never be returned. The fire crackled again, the only sound in the heavy silence. Daniel swallowed hard. He didn't know why, but his hands felt cold. "Samuel," Elias said, laughed at first, brushed it off. But then he began to notice. People looked at him differently. Not with admiration, not with warmth, but with something else. And the laughter he had once enjoyed felt hollow, as if the world had changed in some way he couldn't quite understand. The weight of his words had caught up to him. Elias let the moment sink in before he leaned back against the tree. And that, my friends, is how a single moment, a single sentence, can shape a life. Not just the life of the one who hears it, but the one who speaks it. The village square remained quiet. No one moved. Daniel sat frozen, staring at the flames. He thought about the words he had spoken in his own life, the times he had laughed at someone's expense. He had never given it a second thought. But now he wondered if anyone else had. Elias exhaled slowly, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. We often forget that words are not merely sounds. They linger. They take root. They can heal, or they can wound in ways deeper than we realize. A gust of wind stirred the leaves above them, making them rustle like whispers in the dark. The weight of the story pressed upon them all, unspoken but understood. Daniel lowered his gaze, his mind turning over memories he had once ignored. The night stretched on, the villagers wrapped in thought. No one dared to break the silence. And somewhere in the distance, the echo of Elias's words seemed to linger in the air, refusing to fade. The silence that followed Elias's words felt heavy, stretching across the village square like an invisible weight. The fire crackled, sending small embers into the night air, but no one spoke. It was as if they were all caught in the grip of something deeper, something uncomfortable yet impossible to ignore. Daniel sat motionless, his thoughts tangled. He wasn't sure why this story unsettled him so much, but it did. He had always believed that words were just words. They didn't have power unless someone gave them power. But now, he wasn't so sure. Elias remained still, his face calm, yet his eyes held something deeper, something knowing. He let the silence linger, as if he was waiting for the weight of his words to fully settle before he continued. "Samuel," Elias said at last, his voice quieter than before, tried to forget. He told himself that Lucas would be fine, that he was only being dramatic. But as days passed, something changed. People no longer laughed as easily in his presence. Conversations quieted when he walked by. His friends, once eager to follow his lead, now seemed uncertain, their laughter forced, their words hesitant. Daniel felt a strange tightness in his chest. He had seen this before. He had been part of it. When someone became the center of attention, their words carried weight. But when that attention shifted, when people started looking at them differently, everything changed. Elias leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. At first, Samuel ignored it. He carried on as if nothing had happened. But one evening, as he sat by the riverbank alone, he heard footsteps behind him. When he turned, he saw Lucas standing there. A small murmur rippled through the crowd. Even Daniel felt himself leaning in slightly, anticipation tightening in his stomach. "Lucas didn't speak right away," Elias continued. "He just stood there, looking at Samuel, his expression unreadable. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he said, 'Do you even know what you did?'" The question hung in the air, even in the present moment. It was the kind of question that didn't have a simple answer. Samuel wanted to laugh it off, to say it was nothing, Elias said, but for the first time he hesitated, because deep down, something in Lucas's voice unsettled him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness. It was something else. Something far worse. Daniel clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. He had never really thought about the people he had teased before. If they had ever stood before him and asked the same question, what would he have said? Elias let the moment settle before he went on. Samuel didn't know what to say. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. And so, Lucas gave him a small, sad smile and said, "You will." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Samuel sitting there, staring at the dark water, a strange, heavy feeling pressing on his chest. The villagers sat in tense silence, some glancing at each other, others lost in their own thoughts. That night, Elias said, his voice softer now, Samuel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He tried to shake off the feeling, to tell himself that Lucas was overreacting. But the words wouldn't leave his mind. "Do you even know what you did?" Daniel swallowed hard. He could almost hear those words himself, echoing somewhere deep in his mind. Elias sighed, running a hand over his knee as if the weight of the story was just as heavy for him. Days passed, and things did not go back to normal. If anything, they got worse. The laughter that once followed Samuel had disappeared. Conversations became shorter. People didn't look at him the same way anymore. And it wasn't just about what he had said to Lucas, it was about what those words had revealed about him. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the villagers around him. He wasn't the only one. Some looked away, while others sat rigid, their expressions unreadable. And then, Elias continued, one afternoon, Samuel's father called him aside. He was not an unkind man, but he was not one to ignore what needed to be said. There was a time, his father told him, when your words brought people close. But now, they push them away. Do you understand why? Samuel had no answer. He only stood there, unsure, uncomfortable. His father did not scold him. He did not raise his voice. He only said, "A wound from a sword can heal. But a wound from words, that is something a person carries inside. Some wounds close, but some do not. And the worst part? You do not get to decide which ones heal." A heavy quiet fell over the square. Elias let the moment linger, letting the words settle into the hearts of those listening. Samuel wanted to believe it wasn't true, he said, but deep down, he knew it was. And from that moment on, the question Lucas had asked him became something else. It was no longer just, "Do you even know what you did?" It became, "Can you ever take it back?" The fire crackled, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted into the night. Daniel let out a slow breath. His heart was pounding, though he didn't know why. He had never thought much about the weight of his words before. But now, as he sat there, he felt them all. Every joke, every comment, every thoughtless thing he had ever said. And just like Samuel, he wasn't sure if they could ever be taken back. Samuel walked through the village, feeling the weight of something he couldn't quite name. The streets were the same, the faces familiar, but everything felt different. It was as if an invisible wall had risen between him and the people he had once laughed with, joked with. No one had said anything outright, there were no accusations, no punishments, but silence had a way of speaking louder than words. Everywhere he went, he felt it. A hesitation before someone met his eyes. A quiet pause before a conversation resumed after he passed. A lingering look that held something unreadable. The world had shifted, and Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the wrong side of it. He tried to tell himself it didn't matter, that people would forget, that things would go back to normal. But days turned into weeks, and the feeling only grew stronger. It followed him like a shadow, settling deep in his chest. And worst of all, the question still echoed in his mind. Do you even know what you did? One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, he made his way toward the riverbank. It was where everything had started, and somehow he felt drawn to it. The air was cool, the water still, reflecting the sky above like a mirror. He stood there for a long time, staring at his own reflection, before a voice broke the quiet. "You look lost." Samuel turned sharply. Lucas stood a few feet away, his posture relaxed but his gaze steady. There was no anger in his eyes, no resentment. And yet, something about the way he looked at Samuel made his stomach twist. Samuel opened his mouth, then closed it. The words he wanted to say felt heavy, tangled. He had spent so much time trying to push everything away, but now that Lucas was here, face to face, the weight of it all crashed down on him. Lucas studied him for a moment before stepping closer. "You don't have to say it," he said quietly. "I already know." Samuel swallowed hard. "Know what?" Lucas sighed, shaking his head. That you didn't mean to. He glanced at the water, his expression unreadable. But that doesn't change the fact that you did. Samuel felt something tighten in his chest. He wanted to defend himself, to explain, to say something that would make it all go away. But there was nothing to say. Lucas was right. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant chirping of crickets. Then Lucas turned back to him, his gaze softer now, but still steady. Words don't disappear, Samuel. They stay. Sometimes in ways you never see. Samuel looked away, shame creeping up his spine. He had never thought about it like that before. To him, words had always been just words. But now, standing here, he realized how wrong he had been. Lucas exhaled slowly. You asked me once why I stopped coming around. Why I changed. He hesitated, then met Samuel's eyes. It wasn't just because of what you said that night. It was because, for the first time, I saw myself the way you did. And I started to believe it. Samuel's breath caught. He hadn't expected that. Lucas gave him a small, sad smile. That's what words do. They don't just hurt in the moment. They shape people. And sometimes, they leave marks that don't fade. A lump formed in Samuel's throat. He wanted to take it back, to erase the past, to undo the damage. But there were no words for that. No way to turn back time. The weight of his actions, of his words, pressed down on him harder than ever before. And for the first time, he truly understood. Lucas turned to leave, but before he did, he glanced back. You can't change what's already been said, Samuel, he said softly. But what you say next, that's up to you. And then he was gone, disappearing into the night, leaving Samuel standing there, alone with the echoes of his own words. Samuel stood by the riverbank long after Lucas had disappeared, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite piece together. The air was still, the water unmoving, yet everything inside him churned with unease. He had thought this moment would bring closure, that facing Lucas would somehow lift the weight pressing down on him. But instead, it had only grown heavier. He turned to leave, but a voice from the darkness made him freeze. You finally see it, don't you? Samuel's breath caught. He spun around, searching the shadows. For a moment, he thought it was Lucas again, but the voice was different. Lower, edged with something unreadable. Then, from beneath a nearby tree, a figure stepped forward. It was Nathan. Samuel's stomach twisted. Nathan had always been there, always laughing along, always standing beside him. But now, the way he looked at Samuel was different. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by something else, something colder. I knew this would happen, Nathan said, taking slow steps toward him. You thought it was all just fun, didn't you? Just harmless words. His tone was sharp, cutting through the quiet like a blade. But now you're realizing what I've known for a long time. Samuel frowned, his pulse quickening. What are you talking about? Nathan let out a short, bitter laugh. Come on, Samuel. You're not the only one who said things. We all did. But the difference between us. He took another step closer, his voice lowering. You were the one everyone followed. Samuel's heart pounded. He had never thought about it like that before. You don't even see it, do you? Nathan's eyes locked onto his, unblinking. It wasn't just Lucas. He paused, letting the words sink in. There were others. Samuel felt something inside him go cold. Nathan tilted his head slightly, watching him. You remember Anna, don't you? Samuel's breath caught. Anna. The name hit him like a sudden gust of wind, knocking the air from his lungs. He hadn't thought about her in a long time. Not since she left the village months ago. He swallowed hard. What about her? Nathan's jaw clenched. She left. Samuel. And do you know why? A strange dread crept over him. She wanted to move to the city, he said, though the words felt uncertain even as he spoke them. That was what everyone had said, wasn't it? Nathan let out a slow breath. No. She left because she couldn't take it anymore. His voice was quieter now, but no less sharp. The way people talked about her. The way you talked about her. Samuel's stomach twisted painfully. Memories flickered through his mind. Small moments he had barely thought about at the time. The jokes, the comments, the way people whispered when Anna walked by. And yes, he had laughed. He had added his own words to those whispers. But he had never thought it mattered. Nathan watched the realization settle in. You don't even remember, do you? He shook his head. That's the thing, Samuel. Words are easy to throw around. But the people who hear them. He took a step back, his expression unreadable. They remember. Samuel felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. Nathan turned to leave, then paused. If you think Lucas was the only one your words changed, you're wrong, he said over his shoulder. You've been shaping people's lives for a long time. You just never bothered to see it. And then, just like Lucas before him, Nathan disappeared into the night, leaving Samuel standing there, the weight of his past pressing down on him harder than ever. Samuel's legs felt weak beneath him as he stood alone by the riverbank, his breath unsteady. The echoes of Nathan's words rattled in his mind, pressing against him like a weight he couldn't shake. It wasn't just Lucas. There were others. The truth of it stung in a way nothing ever had before. His mind raced, pulling up memories he had long ignored. Anna's quiet glances, the way her shoulders would stiffen whenever she passed a group of them, the forced smile she wore, the way she used to speak less and less, until one day she spoke no more. He had never once thought to ask why. He had just accepted it, assumed she was fine, until she was gone. The realization burned through him like fire. It had never been just words. It had been more. For the first time, he understood. Samuel turned abruptly, his feet moving before he could think. He needed to do something, to say something. But as he took his first hurried step away from the riverbank, he nearly collided with someone standing just behind him. It was Lucas. Samuel froze, his chest tightening. He hadn't expected to see him again, not so soon. And yet, Lucas stood there, his face unreadable, as if he had been waiting for something. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally, Samuel forced himself to meet Lucas's gaze. You were right, he said, his voice quieter than he expected. About everything. Lucas studied him for a moment before tilting his head slightly. And now? Samuel swallowed hard. Now. I don't know what to do. The words felt small, but they were the truest thing he had ever said. Lucas let out a slow breath, glancing at the dark water beside them. You can't change the past, he said. But that doesn't mean you do nothing. He looked back at Samuel, his expression unreadable. It's not just about regret, Samuel. It's about what you do with it. Samuel felt something shift inside him. He had spent so much time thinking about what had already been done, what couldn't be taken back. But what if that wasn't the point? His hands clenched at his sides. I have to fix it. Lucas raised an eyebrow. Fix it. I don't know how, Samuel admitted. But I have to try. Lucas was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Then start with the people who are still here. The word struck Samuel harder than he expected. The people who were still here. His mind immediately went to the faces in the village. The ones who still avoided his gaze, the ones who had been quiet for too long. And suddenly, he knew where he needed to go. Without another word, he turned and started walking, his steps firm. For the first time in a long time, he knew exactly what he had to do. But just as he reached the edge of the village, just as he prepared himself to face the people he had wronged, he heard something that made his breath catch. A voice. Familiar, distant, one he hadn't heard in months. He turned sharply, his heart pounding, his mind racing to make sense of it. Because standing at the far end of the street, half hidden in the shadows, was Anna. And she was watching him. Samuel's breath caught in his chest as he stared at Anna. For a moment, he wasn't sure if she was really there or if his mind was playing tricks on him. But the way the faint light of the village lanterns flickered against her face, the way her gaze held his from across the distance, there was no mistaking it. She was real. His feet felt rooted to the ground, but something inside him pushed him forward. Slowly, hesitantly, he took a step toward her. She didn't move, didn't look away, just watched him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Was it anger, sadness, or something else entirely? As he got closer, he could finally see the details of her face. She looked different, not in a way that time alone could change, but in the way someone does when they've carried something heavy for too long. There was a quiet strength in her now, but also something guarded, something distant. He stopped a few feet away, unsure of what to say. How do you start a conversation with someone you helped push away? Anna was the one who spoke first. You look surprised to see me. Samuel let out a shaky breath. I didn't think you'd ever come back. She nodded slightly, her eyes never leaving his. I almost didn't. Her voice was steady, but Samuel could hear the weight behind it. He swallowed hard, guilt pressing against his ribs. He hesitated, then forced himself to continue. I never realized. I didn't think. He stopped again, frustrated at how useless words felt now. Anna studied him for a moment, then let out a small, quiet sigh. You didn't think it mattered. Samuel lowered his gaze, ashamed. I didn't think at all. A silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. Then Anna spoke again, her tone softer this time. I used to wonder if I was imagining it, if I was just being too sensitive. But every time I walked past, every time I heard the whispers, I knew. She exhaled slowly, as if releasing something she had been holding onto for too long. And then I left. Because I couldn't be here anymore. Samuel felt his chest tighten. The weight of everything, the things he had said, the things he had laughed at, the things he had ignored, was suffocating. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't expect that to change anything. I need you to know. Anna didn't speak right away. She simply looked at him, as if trying to decide whether his words meant anything. Then, after a long moment, she gave the smallest nod. I know. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something. Samuel exhaled shakily, feeling the first hint of relief in what felt like forever. He knew there was no way to undo the past, no perfect words that could erase what had been done. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to move forward. Anna glanced toward the village, then back at him. People don't change overnight, she said. But they can change. Samuel met her gaze, determination settling into his bones. I want to. A small, knowing smile crossed her face. Then prove it. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Samuel standing there, his heart pounding, his mind racing. For the first time, he understood that words had power, not just to wound but to heal, not just to tear down but to rebuild. And as he took a deep breath and turned toward the village, he knew that what he did next would matter more than anything he had ever said before.